I was actually just thinking about this the other day. When you look at a house, right, and you think about a load-bearing wall.
Right, the structural stuff.
Exactly. There's a certain, I guess, comfort in that permanence. Like, you might absolutely hate the wallpaper in your house.
Yeah, or you want to rip up the carpet.
Right. Or you want to knock out a partition because you want an open concept living room or whatever. But you know that if you grab a sledgehammer and just start wildly swinging at the core structural supports, I mean, the roof is going to literally come down on your head.
Yeah, you have to respect the underlying architecture of the building, even if you desperately want to redecorate.
Exactly. But then, you step into the world of modern cultural critique, and suddenly we're looking at arguments that say, actually, not only is the wallpaper bad, but the foundation itself is entirely rotten.
The whole thing.
Yeah, like the original architects were actively malicious, and the only safe thing to do is just abandon the building completely and construct an entirely separate house next door.
It is the absolute definition of an institutional teardown. I mean, we are looking at a framework today that doesn't just want reform, it demands a total ground-up reset.
That is exactly what we are exploring today. So for everyone listening, today's mission is an extensive, cover-to-cover deep dive into a highly provocative 2025 ebook. It's titled Cancel Culture, Woke Minority Tyranny and Terror by Conrad Riker.
Yeah, and we are going to unpack the architecture of this book. We're looking at exactly how the author deconstructs modern society and, maybe more importantly, what he proposes to build in its place.
Right. And before we get into the actual mechanics of his argument, I want to remind you, if you are listening right now and you enjoy these deep dives, please take a second to hit that like and subscribe button.
It really does help us out.
It does. It helps us keep bringing you this level of detailed analysis. And,
Yeah.
we really need to set the stage for exactly what this text is and who it's aimed at. Because I want to be incredibly clear right up front with you. This book is explicitly written as a war manual.
That is his exact phrase. Yeah, war manual.
War manual. It is targeted directly at men's rights activists and, the red-pilled manosphere. It focuses really heavily on understanding the history of our American institutions before, as the author argues, they were systematically captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And it is a text that pulls zero punches, like none at all. It is highly militant in its language and just completely uncompromising in its worldview.
Totally uncompromising. Now, because this deep dive is going to explore these highly politically charged viewpoints, and we're going into extensive detail to understand his arguments, I need to put a massive flashing disclaimer on this conversation for you.
Yeah, we have to establish the ground rules.
Right, you know how we do things here. We are acting as your impartial guides to this text. We are not endorsing these right-wing or left-wing ideas, nor are we condemning them. Our goal is not to tell you what to think about politics or gender dynamics.
No, we are strictly unpacking the source material.
Yeah.
We're holding it up to the light and helping you understand the architecture of Riker's worldview.
Precisely. We're impartial here. And if this deep dive hooks you and you find yourself wanting to read the source material for yourself to see exactly how he phrases these things, you should definitely check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
And you can also follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yes, definitely do that if this sounds like your thing. So setting the tone here, I read through this whole thing and I found myself trying to categorize it. So I have to ask you, is this book just a very long, very detailed list of modern grievances? Or is it an actual architectural blueprint for a counterculture?
Well, what's really fascinating about Riker's approach is that it basically functions as both, but it distinctly evolves, right? It goes from the former into the latter as you move through the chapters.
Okay, so it starts as a critique and ends as a plan.
Exactly. He doesn't just list complaints. He uses this framework of what he calls historical rhyming to make his case.
Historical rhyming,
Yep.
meaning like he's looking at the past to explain what's happening right now.
Yeah, he constantly compares modern institutions. So we're talking about things like corporate HR departments, university campuses, social media platforms. He compares them to historical authoritarian regimes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the book draws these really extensive parallels to Maoist struggle sessions during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. He brings up the East German Stasi and the Soviet Union.
That is heavy stuff to compare to an HR department.
It is, but his core thesis is that a quote-unquote woke minority has essentially weaponized our modern institutions to dictate reality itself. And therefore, he argues, simply complaining on the internet isn't going to do anything. You need a tactical, strategic manual to build a parallel society.
Okay, so let's unpack this by starting where most adults spend, the vast majority of their waking hours.
Huh.
The workplace.
Right, the 9 to 5.
Yeah. So Riker argues that our corporate institutions weren't just culturally nudged in a progressive direction over time. He says they were structurally captured.
Yeah.
And he uses this very specific, very loaded term, Arbeitverbot 2.0. Am I saying that right? Arbeitverbot. What exactly is he referring to there?
Yeah, so the original Berufsverbot or Arbeitverbot policies historically referred to actual state-mandated employment bans.
State mandated. Like
Yeah.
the government telling you you can't work.
Exactly. We saw this in Germany, where individuals who were deemed to be political radicals or who held extremist views were legally barred from holding certain civil service jobs. It was a literal tool of state control.
Okay.
So Riker is co-opting that historical concept, and he's arguing that corporate America has quietly implemented a modernized, privatized version of it.
So it's like an informal corporate blacklist where the state doesn't even have to ban you because the private sector does the dirty work for them.
That's his exact argument.
But how does he actually quantify this structural capture? I mean, is he just relying on like isolated HR horror stories he found on Twitter, or does he actually bring data to the table?
No, he definitely anchors his argument in institutional data. For instance, he points to a 2022 Harvard study, and this study claims that 23% of Fortune 500 companies now openly check for ideological alignment during the hiring process.
Wait. I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of that. Checking for ideological alignment during hiring. Does that mean they are actively asking political questions in job interviews?
Yeah.
Like, who did you vote for?
Not quite that blunt. According to the parameters Riker highlights, it usually takes the form of requiring diversity statements as a mandatory part of the application process.
Oh, okay.
Or they are running candidate social media profiles through third-party screening services to flag any language that deviates from, corporate inclusivity standards.
So they're vetting your past internet history for thought crimes before you even get an interview.
Right. And he pairs this with another really wild statistic. He notes that the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, reported a massive 37% spike in wrongful termination lawsuits that are specifically tied to political speech in the workplace.
A 37% spike.
Yeah.
So he uses those numbers to argue that basic competence, like your actual skill and performance in your daily role, is becoming entirely secondary to ideological obedience.
Yes.
It sounds like he's suggesting that you aren't just expected to do your job well anymore. You are expected to enthusiastically repeat very specific political phrases.
That is the core of his critique here. Riker asserts that the modern corporate environment requires active submission. And to illustrate what that submission actually looks like, he brings in some incredibly visceral anecdotes.
Let's look at one of those specific cases, because the one about the Boeing engineer really jumped out at me.
Oh yeah, this is a pivotal example in the book.
Tell me about this.
So Riker details a situation where a Boeing engineer was supposedly forced to write the phrase, quote, "I'm sorry for my biological advantages," unquote, 100 times during a mandatory corporate training workshop.
100 times?
Yeah.
Like a child writing lines on a chalkboard in detention.
Literally, yes.
But what was the precipitating event? I mean, what was his actual crime in this scenario to deserve that?
According to the account Riker provides in the book, the engineer simply used the word logically during a meeting.
Logically.
Yes. The facilitator of the workshop allegedly deemed the word logically to be a microaggression rooted in patriarchal white supremacist thinking.
Wait, how is the word logically a microaggression?
Because, according to the facilitator's framework, it suggests a dismissal of quote-unquote lived experiences and emotional truths. It centers empirical thought over emotional reality.
I am really trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of this. Forcing an adult, a professional aerospace engineer, to write lines over the use of the word logically. Riker frames this as a humiliation ritual.
Right. Precisely. He argues this isn't about teaching employees how to cooperate better or have a nicer workplace. He says it's a deliberate exercise in breaking down an individual's psychological autonomy.
Wow.
And this is where he compares it directly to Maoist struggle sessions.
Right, you mentioned that earlier. For listeners who might not have their 20th century Chinese history totally fresh in their minds, what exactly was a Maoist struggle session?
Sure. So during the Cultural Revolution in China, if you were accused of holding bourgeois or counter-revolutionary thoughts, you would be brought before a crowd. And this was often a crowd of your own peers, your students, or your coworkers.
Everybody knew.
Exactly. And you would be verbally and physically abused, forced to confess to your ideological crimes, and then required to publicly apologize and pledge loyalty to the new order.
So the goal wasn't actually justice, it was just public submission.
Right. It was to instill absolute terror in everyone else watching.
And Riker is drawing a direct line from that historical terror tactic where people were literally killed to modern HR diversity trainings. That is a massive escalation in rhetoric. I mean, he also points to higher profile cases to build this narrative, right? Not just anonymous engineers.
He does. He brings up James Damore, the software engineer who was fired from Google back in 2017.
Okay, I remember that one making huge headlines.
Yeah, Damore had circulated an internal memo where he cited peer-reviewed biology and evolutionary psychology to suggest that the gender gap in tech, the reason there are fewer female engineers, might be partially due to different average interests between men and women rather than purely because of systemic sexism.
Right, and Riker's interpretation of that firing is that Damore wasn't fired for being factually wrong, but for committing heresy against the corporate orthodoxy.
Exactly. Riker points out that even though Damore cited established scientific literature, Google's HR department essentially excommunicated him because the conclusion of the science violated their ideological framework. It didn't matter if it was true, it mattered that it was offensive to the HR doctrine.
And then he mentions the whole Disney situation too.
Right, Gina Carano being erased by Disney from the Star Wars franchise.
Right, because she made a social media post comparing the modern political climate, neighbors turning on neighbors over politics, to the early days of 1930s Germany.
And Riker finds the irony there just palpable. He argues Disney proved her exact point by immediately blacklisting her and firing her for expressing an unsanctioned political opinion.
And then he moves from Hollywood to Main Street, right?
Yeah. He details the case of the Christian bakery owner in Seattle who was sued into the absolute ground for refusing to decorate a cake with pronoun sprinkles.
Pronoun sprinkles.
Yes, essentially demanding the baker endorse a specific gender ideology on a custom cake.
Okay, so he's pulling examples from big tech, from major entertainment, and from tiny small businesses to argue this is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And Riker wraps all of this up in a concept he calls the ESCR-IBE score. What exactly is that?
So Riker frames the ESCR-IBE score as a rigged, often entirely hidden corporate metric. The acronym stands for Equity, Social, Corporate, Responsibility, Inclusion, Belonging, and Environmental.
That is a lot of buzzwords, one acronym.
It really is. But he argues it functions as a shadow system. It's used to silently blacklist individuals and entire companies that don't toe the progressive line.
It almost sounds like, you know how car insurance companies want to plug those little digital trackers into your vehicle?
Oh yeah, to monitor your braking and acceleration.
Right, to monitor your habits, and then they secretly adjust your rates based on how you drive. But this is like that applied to your personal politics.
Yeah.
It's like a cultural credit score that determines if you are even allowed to participate in the economy.
That is an incredibly apt way to look at it. And if we connect this to the bigger historical picture he's painting, Riker is drawing a direct line from these modern corporate metrics to the 1950s Hollywood blacklist.
Where careers were completely ruined over alleged communist ties.
Right, sometimes entirely fabricated ties. But as we discussed with the Maoist sessions, he goes even further back than the 50s. He actually compares the modern HR department to the French Revolution's Committee of Public Safety.
The Committee of Public Safety. Okay, hold on. That was Robespierre's group during the Reign of Terror, right?
Correct. The committee was established to protect the newly formed republic against its ideological enemies. They passed something called the Law of Suspects.
Which sounds terrifying just by the name.
It was. It basically allowed them to execute anyone who, by their conduct or their associations or just their words, showed themselves to be, quote, enemies of liberty, unquote.
So totally subjective.
Completely. And Riker argues that just like the committee guillotined dissidents supposedly for their own good and the good of the Republic, the modern HR department blacklists and economically ruins anyone accused of holding unsafe opinions, all in the name of creating a safe workspace.
Okay, I understand the historical parallel he is drawing, but here is where I really struggle to see the mechanics of his argument working in the real world.
Okay, lay it out.
So, Riker cites a Cato Institute survey, finding that 62% of Americans are biting their tongues daily out of fear that some activist coworker, or like a Twitter Karen, is going to dox them or report them for wrongthing.
Right, that's a huge majority.
6 out of 10 people. If the vast majority of people are silent and secretly disagree with these extreme policies, how does a screeching minority actually hold the power? I mean, Fortune 500 boards are ultimately motivated by profit, not philosophy, right? What is the mechanism of control that forces a massive billion-dollar corporation to submit to a fringe minority opinion?
This is a crucial tension in the text, and Riker actually spends a lot of time addressing exactly this point. He explains the mechanics of this through a concept he calls the conveyor belt of cultural surrender.
The conveyor belt. Okay, break down the gears of that machine for me. How does it operate?
Well, it's a four-step mechanical process that explains exactly how a fringe idea becomes a mandatory corporate policy. So step one is the initiation phase. Activist groups generate outrage, or they introduce a radical new ideological framework. And this is usually done on a college campuses or in hyper-niche online spaces.
So it starts at the absolute fringes, where the most dedicated true believers are operating.
Right. Then comes step two, which is media propaganda. The activist framework is picked up by sympathetic journalists. They normalize the radical idea, packaging it not as some fringe theory, but as a matter of basic human decency or progress.
So they rebrand it.
Exactly. And they frame anyone who opposes it as a bigot.
Okay, so the media gives it a respectable veneer and attaches a massive moral cost to opposing it. If you disagree, you're evil.
Exactly. Which triggers step three, corporate virtue signaling. And this directly answers your question about the Fortune 500 boards.
Right, the profit motive.
Exactly. Companies are terrified of bad PR, they hate activist boycotts, and they really fear internal revolts by their youngest, loudest employees on Slack or whatever. So to protect their brand and their stock price, they adopt these newly normalized frameworks into their HR policies. They don't necessarily believe in the ideology. They're just buying protection money in the form of compliance.
Oh, wow. So this is where fear overrides the actual core function of the company. The middle manager enforces the pronoun policy, not because he believes in it, but because he just doesn't want to be the one holding the bag if an activist blog writes a hit piece on his department.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about risk mitigation. And that leads to step four, the final stage, which is legal coercion.
So it becomes law.
Yes. What started as an activist hashtag becomes a media talking point, which becomes a mandatory corporate HR policy, and eventually it is codified into state or federal law, or it's interpreted as such by activist judges and courts.
So by the time the average person, that 62% who are just trying to do their jobs and biting their tongues, by the time they realize what is actually happening, the ideology is already entirely baked into the employee handbook and the legal code. You either comply with the new reality or you lose your livelihood.
Right. Riker argues the majority is essentially held hostage by a highly organized, highly vocal minority that profoundly understands how to manipulate institutional fear and leverage digital outrage.
Wait, if we follow Riker's logic here, the workplace is captured to silence men economically. But the book argues that if you truly want to neutralize resistance, economic threats aren't enough. You have to go deeper.
Right, you have to go after their psychology.
Exactly. He says the next logical step for this movement is to attack the psychological foundation of men, to pathologize the very essence of masculinity itself.
Yes, chapters 2 and 7 delve deeply into this psychological warfare. He actually titles one of the chapters Feminism's Guilt Racket.
Feminism's guilt racket.
Yeah. Riker argues that in modern society, masculinity is no longer praised as a vital societal force. Instead, it is treated as a systemic disease that needs to be cured or medicated away.
And to illustrate this, he highlights this incredible story about a man named Jim Barnes, a Texas fire captain. Tell me about this case.
This is a really striking example. According to the book, in 2021, Captain Barnes responded to a catastrophic structure fire. It was chaos. And during this, he apparently saved 3 children from a falling house.
I mean, he was a literal, undeniable hero in that moment.
Right, the exact kind of person you want showing up when your life is on the line.
Totally.
But Riker notes that Barnes's reward wasn't a medal. Instead, he faced a disciplinary hearing.
Wait, what? Why?
Because during the high-stress rescue operation, while the house was literally falling down, he raised his voice and yelled at a female dispatcher to get more equipment to the scene.
He yelled for equipment during a fire.
Yes. And the complaint filed against him cited, quote, aggressive and intimidating behavior, unquote, that created an, quote, unsafe emotional environment.
An unsafe emotional environment. While he was actively pulling kids out of a physically burning building. That is just a jarring juxtaposition.
And Riker uses that juxtaposition very deliberately. He contrasts this on-the-ground reality of what men actually do with high-level institutional doctrine. Specifically, he points to the American Psychological Association's 2018 guidelines for treating men and boys.
Wait, the American Psychological Association, The APA actually issued guidelines addressing masculinity itself. What did they say?
They did. In 2018, the APA issued guidelines that literally labeled traditional masculinity, which they defined by traits like anti-femininity, achievement, eschewal of the appearance of weakness and adventure, risk, and violence. They labeled it as, on the whole, quote, psychologically harmful, unquote.
That is a fascinating way to parse human behavior. I mean, think about the words you just read. Eschewal of the appearance of weakness and risk. Aren't those the exact traits required to run into a burning building to save those kids?
That is exactly Riker's argument. He argues that the very traits that literally built civilizations, competitiveness, stoicism, calculated risk-taking, the drive to protect, are now being classified as mental disorders by the therapeutic class.
So they're treating natural male behavior as a pathology.
Right. He actually cites CDC data claiming that young boys are 40% more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorders or ADHD simply for exhibiting normal, rambunctious male behavior.
He's basically saying we are medicating boys just for being boys. And he claims there's a massive financial incentive behind this, right?
Oh, absolutely. He points to what he estimates is an $8 billion industry funneled through Fortune 500 DEI programs. He claims these programs are specifically designed to teach men to, quote, unlearn competence.
Unlearned competence. That is such a loaded phrase. But he also points out that there is a massive financial backlash when companies push this too far into the consumer space, right? Like when they push it on regular guys.
He does, and he uses the famous Gillette advertising campaign as his primary example here.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, he notes that Gillette lost an estimated $8 billion in market value after running their 2019 toxic masculinity ad.
Right. That ad essentially took a lot of these progressive talking points and just lectured their core demographic of male shavers about bullying, mansplaining, and harassment.
Exactly.
Why does Riker think it failed so spectacularly from a business standpoint?
Well, Riker views that Gillette ad as a fatal miscalculation by corporate America. He says the marketing executives, living in their coastal ideological bubbles, assumed that modern men wanted to be scolded and enlightened by a razor company.
Right, like they wanted to lecture with their shave.
Exactly. But instead, men looked at the ad, felt insulted that a soap company was treating them like latent criminals, and they simply voted with their wallets. They switched brands overnight.
Wow. But while he sees consumer boycotts as effective, Riker argues the most damaging front of this war against men isn't happening in razor commercials or corporate HR trainings. He says the real devastation is happening in the family courts.
Yes, the statistics he pulls regarding the legal system are just staggering. He cites Pew Research showing that 78% of alimony payers are men.
78%.
Yeah, and this is despite dual-income households and 50-50 custody becoming the theoretical standard in modern law.
So he's arguing the system is inherently structurally biased against men when a marriage dissolves.
He takes it a step further than just financial bias. He tells the story of a Utah father in 2021 who was locked in a custody battle.
Okay, what happened there?
According to Riker's account, the judge actually ruled against the father and reduced his custody time because the father had taken his young son hunting.
Hunting, like legally hunting.
Yes. The judge supposedly cited this as promoting toxic gender roles and exposing the child to unnecessary violence.
Taking your son hunting, a tradition that literally goes back to the dawn of humanity, is now grounds for losing your child in family court.
That is wild.
If we look at Riker's underlying analysis here, what is the end game? Why does he believe institutions are so intent on removing these traditional fathers from the home?
Well, he argues that society is systematically replacing male authority figures with diversity consultants and therapeutic state interventions. The state wants to be the father. Ah, I see. And he brings in sociological data to show the real-world cost of this replacement. He points to University of Michigan data showing that boys raised without fathers in the home suffer depression rates triple the national average.
Triple the rate. I mean, that is a public health crisis by any definition.
And he pairs this with data from the Urban Institute. They showed a 45% drop in teen drug use and gang affiliation in communities that managed to establish active, consistent male mentorship programs.
So this is one of the more provocative claims in the book, and I really want to explore the implications of it, because Riker essentially says we are trading the architects and protectors of civilization for sensitivity coaches.
Yes.
And he points to a really raw statistic to ground this. He notes that men make up 93% of workplace fatalities.
Yes. We're talking logging, commercial fishing, highline electrical work, construction, deep shaft mining.
Exactly. Men are the ones doing the most dangerous, dirty, physically breaking job to keep the lights on, the water running, and the roads paved.
Right.
If society fundamentally relies on this supposedly toxic grit to physically build and protect itself, what happens when the institutions actually succeed in curing it? If you convince men that their inherent drive to conquer and build is evil, who climbs the electrical poles during a hurricane?
Riker's answer to that question is totally uncompromising. He says the result is societal collapse.
Collapse.
Yes. He argues that weakness invariably invites predators, both domestic and foreign, and he uses a historical analogy to drive this home. He says the Roman legion didn't sit in a vulnerability circle and discuss their feelings of inadequacy before sacking Carthage.
Right.
They relied on extreme aggression and iron discipline.
So he believes that the moment a culture pathologizes the testosterone required to defend its borders and build its infrastructure, it essentially signs its own death warrant.
That is his exact thesis. He even notes that throughout anthropology, purely matriarchal societies historically have a near 0% success rate in surviving invasions from patriarchal neighbors. Yeah. Riker believes peace is a luxury paid for by men capable of violence, and if you demonize those men, you lose the peace entirely.
Okay, so following Riker's logic, the attack on the workplace silences men, and the attack on masculinity psychologically disarms them.
Yes.
According to the book, this paves the way for what he sees as the ultimate institutional power grab, which is a full-scale war on objective reality itself, replacing empirical, observable facts with lived experiences and the absolute weaponization of trauma.
Yes. This brings us to Chapter 11 and his discussion on gender and speech. Riker views this arena as the ultimate, final test of institutional compliance.
The final test.
Yeah. His logic is essentially Orwellian. He says if a corporation, a university, or a government can force you to verbally deny what your own eyes see, they have absolute, unquestionable control over you.
And he tackles the transgender sports debate head-on to illustrate this forced denial of reality, doesn't he?
He does, and he uses a very specific historical analogy here, comparing the current push for inclusion in women's sports to East German doping in the 1970s.
Wow, okay, that's a very pointed, highly controversial comparison. Break that down for me.
It perfectly encapsulates his view. So for context, during the Cold War, East Germany had a state-sponsored, highly secretive doping program orchestrated by the Stasi. They pumped their female Olympic athletes full of synthetic testosterone and anabolic steroids.
And the physical results of that were entirely undeniable, right? Like you could see it.
Completely undeniable. These female athletes developed incredibly deep voices, extreme muscle mass, and male pattern baldness. But because of that artificial testosterone, they shattered world swimming and track records by obscene margins. They swept the medals.
Right. And so how does Riker apply that to today?
Riker argues that today's gender activists are functioning exactly like the Stasi, just draped in rainbow flags. They are demanding that society ignore the massive, obvious biological advantages of male puberty, just as the Olympic Committee was forced to ignore the obvious doping of the East Germans back then.
And to put hard numbers to this claim, he details the swimming stats between Leah Thomas, who is a transgender woman who transitioned after going through male puberty, and Olympic silver medalist Emma Weyant.
Yes. When they raced in the NCAA championships, Thomas crushed Weyant by 1.75 seconds in the 500-yard freestyle.
Now, to a layman, 1.75 seconds might not sound like a lot.
Right. But in elite swimming, that is an absolute blowout. But, more importantly, Riker points out that this winning time represented a massive 38-second improvement over Thomas's previous personal bests when competing against men prior to transitioning.
38 seconds. That is an eternity in a pool. So Riker's basically asking the reader, if we acknowledge the science of sports medicine, like if we know that mere bone density, lung capacity, and fast-twitch muscle fibers are biologically different and provide a permanent advantage, why are our institutions pretending this is fair?
Because, according to Riker, the institutions don't actually care about fairness or athletic integrity. He says it's about what he terms equality cannibalism.
Equality cannibalism.
Yes. He quotes Riley Gaines, the collegiate swimmer who was forced to race against Thomas and share a locker room with her. Gaines said, quote, "We're told to smile and step aside while men take our trophies," unquote.
Right.
So Riker frames this institutional demand to smile while being marginalized as a demand for moral tribute. You must submit to the new ideology, even if it cannibalizes women's rights in the process.
Which leads right into his exploration of what he calls the fraudulent trauma card. And I have to say, the anecdotes he pulls for this section are just staggering.
Oh, they are.
He details this incident at UC Berkeley involving a conservative speaker, Michael Knowles. What happened there?
So the university invited Knowles to speak on campus. In response, a subset of students claimed that his mere physical presence on campus, even if they didn't attend the speech, was an act of violence.
Being on the same zip code.
Yes. One student filed a formal complaint claiming that knowing a conservative was on campus triggered somatic flashbacks and intense psychological trauma.
So how did the university administration respond to this claim of trauma? Did they just ignore it?
No. According to Riker's data, UC Berkeley administration spent $87,000 of university funds to install panic pods and hire emergency grief counselors for the students to use during the hour Knowles was speaking.
$87,000 for panic pods.
Yes. But the punchline, Riker notes, is that security footage from outside the venue showed the student who filed the initial trauma complaint laughing, taking selfies, and live tweeting protests during the event.
Taking selfies while the school spends 87 grand on grief counselors for them. It's absurd.
It is.
And he uses this to argue that the word trauma has lost its actual meaning. Because he pairs that campus anecdote with a massive federal statistic regarding veterans, right?
Yes, this is where he connects the campus culture to broader societal rot. He cites a stunning 2023 audit of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
The VA.
Right. The audit claimed that a staggering 72% of current PTSD claims have absolutely no verifiable medical or combat-related proof.
72%.
Yeah. Riker is drawing a hard line here between legitimate war zone trauma, the kind that destroys lives, and what he sees as the commodification of victimhood by a pampered generation looking for an excuse to avoid accountability.
Right, he has a specific phrase for this. He calls modern trauma the luxury brand of the lazy.
Exactly. He describes a massive institutionalized system that he calls a victimocracy.
A victimocracy. I'm imagining a system where power is determined entirely by how much you have supposedly suffered. How does he see that actually functioning mechanically?
He describes it literally as a pyramid scheme.
Okay.
At the top, you have massive grievance grants and federal funding. This money flows into university gender studies and critical theory departments.
Right.
These departments then produce graduates whose primary skill set is identifying microaggressions, so they are essentially professional victims. These graduates then get hired to staff corporate HR departments and university administration roles. And once they are in power, they mandate the very DEI trainings and bias reporting systems that keep the whole cycle funded, empowered, and unquestionable.
It's a completely self-sustaining ecosystem of grievance. But the cost of this isn't just wasted money or annoying corporate seminars. Riker argues this weaponization of language has terrifying legal consequences.
It absolutely does.
He points outside the U.S. to Canada's Bill C-16. What is the significance of that law in his eyes?
So Bill C-16 was legislation in Canada that added gender identity and expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, while proponents argued it was simply about protecting a vulnerable minority from discrimination.
Sure, it's not signed on paper.
Right. But Riker and other critics argue that the way the law is written, it essentially compels speech.
Compels speech, meaning it forces you to say things, not just prevents you from saying things.
Yes. Riker claims that under this law, consistently misgendering someone can be classified as hate speech, which can theoretically land you in prison or result in massive fines by a human rights tribunal.
So the state can literally punish you for refusing to use their mandated language?
Yes.
And he mentions a similar chilling effect in the UK,
Yeah.
involving a retired nurse.
Yeah, he recounts a story of a retired nurse in the United Kingdom who made a post on her private Facebook page saying all lives matter during the height of the 2020 protests.
Okay, and what happened?
According to Riker, she received a visit from local police at 2 a.m.
2 a.m. over Facebook post.
Yes. They didn't arrest her, but they recorded a non-crime hate incident on her permanent record and warned her that her internet activity was being monitored.
That is the definition of a chilling effect. And returning to the U.S., Riker argues this weaponization of victimhood is destroying lives, specifically on college campuses through Title IX tribunals.
He is highly critical of how universities handle sexual assault allegations internally, bypassing the actual legal system.
Right, because it's handled by school administrators, not judges.
Exactly. He argues these tribunals operate on a presumption of guilt, denying the accused the right to legal counsel or cross-examination. And to back up the danger of this, he notes that the National Registry of Exonerations possesses data suggesting that roughly 15% of all sexual assault cases involve provably false claims.
15%. So he's arguing that 1 in 6 men dragged through this system might be completely innocent, but they end up walking around with a life sentence of social and economic death because they were expelled and branded a predator based on a false accusation.
Exactly. And to combat this weaponization of victimhood, Riker proposes some extreme legal mechanisms of his own.
Right. He doesn't just complain, he suggests countermeasures. What does he want to do?
He suggests implementing what he calls truth serum laws.
Truth serum laws. Okay.
Under his proposal, if someone is found to have lied under the pretense of trauma, especially in Title IX or HR investigations, that lie would carry mandatory severe jail time equal to the punishment the accused would have faced.
Wow. Eye for an eye.
Very much so. Furthermore, he advocates for the creation of a false accuser registry.
Wait, like a sex offender registry, but for people who lie about being victims.
Precisely. A public, searchable database designed to publicly name and shame individuals who weaponize false allegations, forcing them to wear it like a scarlet letter for the rest of their lives. It would make them unemployable and socially ostracized.
I mean, I understand the anger driving that proposal given the stakes of having your life ruined, but I have to ask you, aren't these registries and state-enforced truth tribunals essentially the exact same tactics of authoritarian institutional control he's criticizing?
It's a great question.
He's mad at the HR blacklist, so he wants to build his own government blacklist. Yeah. It's flipped in the other direction.
This is a crucial tension in the book, and it's one Riker actually anticipates. Riker would argue that you cannot fight a systemic existential threat with passive, hands-off libertarianism. He believes the left has already thoroughly weaponized the justice system, the media, and HR. In his view, the time for taking the high road is over.
So fight fire with fire.
Exactly. The only way to establish deterrence against false accusations and ideological capture is mutually assured destruction. It's a distinct shift from a defensive posture to a highly aggressive, offensive one.
Okay, we are going to dive really deep into that offensive strategy shortly. But first, we need to understand how Riker claims this ideology sustains itself across generations. Because to ensure the longevity of any new cultural order, capturing HR departments isn't enough, right?
Right. You have to capture the youth.
You have to rewrite the past. You need, as he calls them, indoctrination factories.
You need the education system. And Riker dedicates a massive portion of the book to analyzing how the American education system, from kindergarten all the way through grad school, has been fundamentally repurposed.
Repurposed from what?
Well, he argues it is no longer designed to teach facts, critical thinking, or marketable skills. Instead, it is designed to program foot soldiers for a cultural revolution.
And he goes hard after specific curricula to prove this, doesn't he? He specifically targets the 1619 Project and critical race theory. Now, CRT is a term that gets thrown around a lot in the media. How does Riker define it in the context of this book?
Riker defines critical race theory not as some obscure, high-level legal framework, but as a hostile, anti-American ideology that views every single human interaction through the lens of racial power dynamics.
Okay.
He argues that it teaches children that their skin color dictates whether they are inherently an oppressor or inherently a victim, completely erasing individual agency and merit.
And he points to a specific ethnic studies curriculum in California to show how this is being applied in real classrooms.
Yes. He dissects a proposed California ethnic studies curriculum that literally labeled founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson as white supremacist terrorists.
Thomas Jefferson, a terrorist.
Yes. But what Riker finds truly insidious is the juxtaposition. Because while the curriculum demonized Jefferson, he notes that it glorified figures like Angela Davis.
Okay, and who is that for our listeners?
She was a known Marxist and a former member of the Communist Party who supported violent radical groups. But the curriculum framed her as a hero of liberation.
So they are tearing down the architects of the American system and replacing them with individuals who actively wanted to dismantle it.
Exactly. Riker views this not as a good faith academic debate about history, but as deliberate, state-sponsored historical gaslighting.
Wow.
And he brings in data to show the academic cost of this shift. He points to standardized testing data showing that in districts where students were heavily immersed in critical race theory and activist-driven curricula, U.S. history test scores actually plummeted by 22%.
So they are learning less actual history, but they are highly proficient in grievance.
That is his conclusion. He argues the goal of these schools isn't to educate, it's psychological conditioning. He says the goal is to make white children grovel for simply existing and to keep minority children perpetually resentful and reliant on the state.
If that's the theory, the practical classroom-level anecdotes he found to support it are absolutely wild. Like, he cites videos exposed by the Libs of TikTok account.
Yes, he highlights a particularly disturbing video of a Brooklyn teacher.
Tell me about this one.
In the video, the teacher is having kindergartners. We are talking about 5-year-old children chant Trans Lives Matter and march around the classroom during what was supposed to be a math drill.
5-year-olds, they don't even know how to tie their shoes yet, but they're being used as political props.
Right. And it's not just in ultra-liberal enclaves like Brooklyn either. He found examples in the Midwest, too.
Oh, really? Where?
He details the case of Mark Johnson, a high school math teacher in Nebraska. Johnson actually had to successfully sue his school district after administration ordered him to undergo retraining.
What was his offense?
He refused to incorporate a lesson plan that framed the Pythagorean theorem and objective mathematics as tools of white supremacy and colonial oppression.
Framing a geometric formula as racist. I mean, it sounds like a parody, but you're saying this was a real lawsuit.
It was a very real lawsuit.
How does Riker contextualize this level of ideological fanaticism?
If we connect this back to his historical framework, Riker explicitly compares this rewriting of reality to the Soviet Union. Specifically, he brings up the Holodomor.
Ah, okay. For listeners who might be fuzzy on their 20th century history, the Holodomor was the artificial famine in Ukraine in the 1930s, right?
Yes. Under Joseph Stalin, Soviet policies deliberately starved millions of Ukrainians to death to crush their independence. It was a literal genocide.
Right.
But Soviet commissars completely erased the Holodomor from the history books. They made it illegal to talk about it, and they officially blamed the starvation on greedy, capitalist farmers hoarding grain.
And Riker is comparing modern education to that.
Yes. He argues that modern education is doing the exact same thing, erasing the successes of Western civilization and blaming all societal failures on the quote-unquote oppressors, white men, and capitalism. He views the modern classroom as a Maoist struggle session where children are systematically separated from their parents' values.
Which brings us to a major theme in the book, what he calls the anti-family agenda and its ties to globalism. He argues this isn't just an American problem, right?
No, not at all. He points out a 2017 incident in Berlin.
What happened there?
A Berlin primary school caused massive controversy when it decided to ban Christmas celebrations entirely. No tree, no songs, no mention of the holiday at all.
In Germany.
Yes. And the administration admitted they did this to appease a vocal 5% minority of Muslim students who felt excluded by the local German traditions.
Wow.
Riker uses this to argue that the institutional left will demand the majority abandon its core cultural heritage the moment a minority claims to be offended.
And he also notes that in Germany, parents can't even opt out of this system because the state has completely banned homeschooling.
Correct. In Germany, if you refuse to send your child to the state-approved schools, the police will literally come to your house, take your children, and put the parents in jail for truancy.
That is terrifying.
Riker views this as the ultimate authoritarian, wet dream total state monopoly over the minds of the youth.
But wait, homeschooling is perfectly legal in the United States. So how is this anti-family agenda operating here if parents can just pull their kids out?
Riker argues the capture in the U.S. is just much more covert. His research team analyzed 3,200 school mental health surveys that were administered to middle and high schoolers across the country.
Okay.
They claim that 83% of these surveys included leading, highly suggestive questions about gender dysphoria and sexual orientation.
Asking middle schoolers leading questions about their gender. But don't parents have to sign off on those medical surveys?
They are supposed to. But Riker discovered that many school districts deliberately hide the parental opt-out forms.
Hide them. How?
They bury them as obscure links at the absolute bottom of the weekly lunch menu PDFs that are emailed to parents, knowing full well that 90% of parents never click on them.
That is so sneaky.
Then the school claims implied consent and administers the psychological surveys anyway.
Wow. He calls this the woke contagion vector, right?
Yes. The idea that activists in the schools are deliberately normalizing deviance and introducing these concepts just before puberty, when neural pathways and adolescent identities are most malleable and vulnerable.
But here's the massive question I have. If the state has the power to ban homeschooling in Europe, and the American schools are hiding psychological surveys and lunch PDFs, to bypass parental rights. How does Riker suggest parents actually fight a system that has full insidious state backing?
Well, this is where Riker pivots to solutions. He praises grassroots movements like Moms for Liberty. He notes a fascinating demographic shift. 42% of Gen X and millennial mothers who previously identified as totally apolitical are now storming school board meetings.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are demanding curriculum transparency rather than just baking cookies for the PTA.
So, angry moms getting involved in local politics, does he see that as enough to fix it?
Not on its own, but he sees it as the catalyst. He points to legislative victories that stem from that anger, like Florida's truth and education laws.
Okay, what do those do?
These laws mandate that schools teach from primary historical sources rather than activist-created fan fiction, and they give parents explicit legal avenues to sue districts that hide gender transitions. He believes you fight state backing by weaponizing local politics, electing firebrand school board members, and using relentless public records requests to force the resignation of activist administrators.
So what does this all mean? We have walked through this comprehensive teardown. We've seen Riker's arguments regarding the capture of the workplace through Arbit Verbat 2.0, the pathologizing of masculinity, the war on objective reality through the trauma card, and the covert indoctrination of kids in the education system.
Right.
This leads us to Section 5, which is the author's ultimate solution. And as we've hinted at, this isn't just about voting differently in the next midterms. Riker outlines a highly tactical, highly aggressive response to basically rebuild society around traditional patriarchy and parallel institutions.
Yes. The final chapters of the book transition from a critique into a literal victory manual. He stops complaining about the rot in the foundation and starts pouring concrete for the new house.
And the absolute bedrock of that new foundation is his unapologetic, unabashed defense of patriarchy.
Yes. Which is a word that instantly raises hackles.
Totally. How does he define a positive patriarchy? He outlines what he calls the 3 laws of patriarchy, right?
He does. The 3 laws are men provide, men protect, men prescribe.
Prescribe, what does he mean by that?
By prescribe, he means setting the moral and structural boundaries of the family and the community. He argues that if you break this triad, if you tell men they aren't needed to provide, that their protection is toxic and their authority is oppressive, you get the modern crisis.
Right.
You get a society where teenage boys think toxic means having calluses on your hands instead of a complex skincare routine.
He wants to reinstill the virtue of grit. And to support this vision, he actually looks internationally for working models, doesn't he? He highly praises Hungary's current government policies.
He is a huge proponent of Hungary's Family First initiatives. Specifically, he highlights their massive financial incentives for traditional families.
Okay, like what?
In Hungary, if a married couple has 3 children, they receive the equivalent of a $35,000 tax break
Wow.
and a lifetime exemption from personal income tax for the mother.
A lifetime exemption from income tax just for having kids. I mean, that is a massive state intervention.
Huge. And Riker wants to import that exact logic to the U.S. He wants to heavily leverage the tax code to financially incentivize traditional single-earner households, specifically to boost Native American birth rates and make the single-income family economically viable again.
Okay, so that's the policy goal. But how does he suggest his readers actually get there from where we are now? He outlines an acronym for his strategy on the ground, WIN.
WIN. It stands for Weaponize Truth, Ignite Resistance, Neutralize Enemies.
Let's break that down, because neutralize enemies is where he gets very specific about what he calls the parallel economy.
Right.
Because Riker believes that conservative boycotts are actually finally working.
He does. For years, conservative boycotts were largely ineffective. But he points to the recent catastrophic financial impacts on Bud Light and Target as proof of concept that the right has finally learned how to wield economic pain effectively.
Okay.
However, his core argument is that boycotting isn't enough. You can't just stop buying from companies that hate you. You have to build viable, high-quality alternatives.
You gotta build the house next door.
Yeah.
So he advocates for a mass exodus from legacy platforms. He says move entirely to alternative tech, like Substack for writing, Rumble for video, and Publicis for commerce.
Yes. He literally tells the reader to burn their Disney Plus login and switch their subscriptions to the Daily Wire Plus.
Right, because there you can watch entertainment where men actually save women instead of the other way around.
Exactly. And he extends this far beyond entertainment. He is calling for massive homeschooling networks, alternative colleges that refuse federal funding so they can actually teach Western civilization without Title IX interference, and the creation of alternative banking structures that explicitly promise never to give a small business an ESG score or freeze an account over political donations.
He wants an entirely insulated economic ecosystem,
Yeah.
and he highlights very specific grassroots examples of this actually working in real time, which I found fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about male-only labor unions. Tell me about the Texas truckers.
This is a wild anecdote. He details a group of independent Texas truckers who formed an informal, male-only coalition.
Okay.
When one of their members was fired by a major logistics company over an allegedly offensive joke made on a private radio channel, the entire coalition refused to pick up loads for that company.
Just a total strike.
Total strike.
Yeah.
Within a week, the supply chain disruption was so severe that the company caved, rehired the driver, and fired the HR rep who initiated the complaint.
Wow.
Riker views this as the template, unapologetic, unified, masculine economic force.
And it's not just blue-collar men flexing this muscle.
Yeah.
He praises a totally different demographic, the tradwife TikTokers.
Yes. On the surface, young women posting videos of themselves baking sourdough bread from scratch in vintage dresses while talking about submitting to their husbands seems innocuous.
Right. Just lifestyle content.
But Riker frames them as engaging in highly effective psychological warfare against modern feminists.
How so?
These women are gaining millions of followers by making traditional gender roles look peaceful, beautiful, and aspirational, which completely undermines the feminist narrative that traditional marriage is a prison.
Ah, I see. He calls this broader movement normcore nationalism.
Yeah.
He highlights a former UAW member in Michigan who organized 400 blue-collar factory workers to flip Macomb County red.
Right.
And their unifying issue wasn't tax policy, it was their absolute refusal to allow transgender athletes onto their daughters' high school swim teams. It's a rebellion of the aggressively normal against the elite fringe.
Exactly.
And speaking of elites, how does he view Elon Musk buying Twitter?
He views the Twitter acquisition as the most significant victory of the decade, but he doesn't frame it as a standard business deal. No, Riker calls it a, quote, corporate raid executed with a meme stock mentality.
I love that phrasing.
It's vivid. He argues that Musk proved that a single, massively wealthy individual could essentially outbid Silicon Valley's thought police, rip the censorship algorithms out by the roots, and restore a digital public square.
Riker's underlying argument across all these examples is that the institutional elite's greatest fear isn't an armed violent rebellion, it's irrelevance.
Yes.
If you starve their platforms of your attention and your dollars, their entire system collapses under its own bloated weight. But I have to jump in here with a massive structural question.
Go for it.
I am looking at the blueprint Riker is proposing. He is advocating for a completely bifurcated society. Two internets, two distinct economies, two entirely separate entertainment industries, two completely different educational realities where children are taught opposing versions of American history. Is a model like that actually sustainable for a single country?
That is the million-dollar question, and it is the exact question this book leaves hanging ominously in the air. Riker assumes that the parallel economy will eventually overtake and starve out the legacy institutions. Why? Because in his view, his parallel economy is built on reality, competence, and merit, whereas the quote-unquote woke institutions are built on fragility, victimhood, and incompetence.
So he thinks it must fail naturally.
Yes, he thinks they will inevitably collapse under their own weight.
But I'm looking at history. I understand his strategy of starving the beast, but history is pretty clear that deeply bifurcated societies usually don't just peacefully coexist in separate lanes forever.
You are absolutely right. Historically, when a society fractures into two entirely separate realities that no longer share the same foundational truths, the same economy, or the same institutions, it leads to deep, sometimes insurmountable civil conflict.
Yeah.
Riker is essentially gambling that the cultural rot in the mainstream institutions is so severe that they will collapse before a kinetic conflict occurs.
So let's synthesize everything we've unpacked here today. To sum up Conrad Riker's cancel culture, woke minority tyranny and terror. He views modern American institutions, from the HR departments of Fortune 500s, to the family courts, to the public schools, to the legacy media, as fully structurally compromised by a hostile, anti-human ideology.
Right.
And he believes the only path forward for the men he is speaking to is a militant, unapologetic return to traditional masculinity and the creation of impenetrable parallel structures to starve the beast and protect their families.
Precisely. For Riker, the time for debate is over. He views compromise as surrender. The book is, in its essence, a manual for cultural secession with the ultimate hope of eventual cultural reconquest.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. If you follow Riker's logic, the solution is separation. But if both sides of the political spectrum increasingly abandon our shared institutions, if we all retreat to our own parallel economies, consuming different news feeds, using different banks, and teaching our kids entirely different versions of history, what happens to the concept of a shared national identity? Does building a fortress to save your specific culture permanently fracture the nation you are supposedly trying to save?
It's the ultimate paradox of the parallel economy. You might successfully protect the foundation of your own house, but in doing so, you lose the neighborhood entirely.
Something heavy to think about as you navigate the modern world. Once again, if you want to explore the source material for yourself and see exactly how Riker constructs these controversial arguments, you should definitely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book, and follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
It is certainly a text that leaves a lasting impression and forces you to examine the structural integrity of the institutions around you.
It really does. Whether you agree with his diagnosis or find it abhorrent, it is a fascinating map of a very specific worldview. Before we go, please remember to take a moment to like and subscribe to the show. We love unpacking these dense, controversial topics for you and breaking down the why and the how behind the headlines. Until next time, keep an eye on those load-bearing walls. Because whether you are actively trying to reinforce them or actively swinging a sledgehammer to tear them down, the underlying structure of the house is definitely changing. Thanks for listening.